Fingers crossed.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to an episode, Ramen number 77, I do believe. This time around, we have Jonathan Tweet, looking to be a little different than our usual fare. He is going to be arguing that there is historical evidence for Jesus or evidence for historical Jesus, whichever is more appropriate for that. Mr. Tweet, how do you do, sir?
Very good. Nice to see you again.
Now, this is not going to be a scholarly conversation because I remember in your debate with Richard Carrier, you professed that you did not have like scholarly accolades, nor, of course, do I. I'm not going to be arguing for Carrier's position because I don't entirely understand it myself, so I wouldn't embrace it if I didn't. I have a different perspective, and I'm going to be listening to you give yours, and we're just going to be two laymen discussing this as best we can.
Yeah,
So,
no.
so you on the historicity of Jesus. I mean, I've got a number of problems with him, and as I said, they're not the same problems as what Richard Carrier would have. I mean, like him, once upon a time, I believed that Jesus was this first century faith healer and all that. But then a number of other things that I happen to come across or read, or through association with mythicists and whatnot, I realize that these things don't add up, and I can no longer consider Jesus to be an actual historical person. What would be your take on that?
Right. Well, like I said in the debate with Dr. Carrier, I can't really prove that Jesus for sure existed. That's sort of beyond what we can do. And so, what I would like my fellow atheists to see is that the most plausible or the most likely explanation for how Christianity there was a Jesus. Maybe there wasn't, but there's no other story that's equally plausible. And that's my position. And you can believe the plausible story or not, but I think we can put our notes together and see that the mainstream historical account is the most plausible explanation for all the evidence that we have.
Okay, I have to disagree right away, but and I'll give my reasons as we proceed. But what are your reasons for thinking a historical Jesus is plausible?
So if you look at my debate with Dr. Carrier, you'll see that he also considers the mainstream account to be plausible. He considers the idea that there was a hillbilly faith healer who got crucified because he was a troublemaker, that is historically plausible. So I think I think people agree that it's plausible. It might not be true, but it's clearly plausible.
Okay.
There's nothing I mean, maybe you would disagree, but if you look at, for example, Dr. Carrier's proposed history of early Christianity, it's far less plausible than the mainstream account.
Okay, well, look, I'm not going to be talking about Carrier's perspective, where he goes up into the angelology. I mean, I would love to have an
Okay.
discussion with him on that so that he can show me exactly where he's getting some of this. My perspective, as I said, is very different. First of all, we have, of course, Paul, who is not apparently talking about a guy who existed just a generation or two before. And then when we get into the earliest of the Christian fathers, I mean, Luke, for example, and even Mark, really, seem to be basing their work on other people's work. Or I read something that I think it was Dr. Robert Price, but it may have been a different source. No, I think it was a different source. It was talking about how the Markan pre-passion narrative, and I wasn't able to pull this up before the podcast. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to have that prepared, but that there was some consideration that the Markan passion narrative is actually based on a different Jesus, and it's based on Josephus in a reference to a different Jesus, which I think was Jesus ben Ananias. And then Luke, when you read Luke, Luke being the next century later, before Luke comes up, and then Luke seems to be describing again his narrative on the passion is apparently based on Josephus all over again. So Josephus seems more integral to this than even the people, even the historicists believe when they constantly cite him as a source.
Well, I mean, if you look at the evidence very differently from how mainstream historians do, you get a very different picture. That what you're describing is very different from what mainstream historians say, or what it looks like when I look at those same books. I'll say you're freezing in and out, and so I'm not sure I'm getting everything that you're saying. We sort of jumped right into looking at the Gospels, and I'm wondering if you would indulge me to sort of give your listeners some context and let them know why an atheist like this to be such an interesting topic.
Okay.
Okay. So I've been sort of interested in the historical Jesus for years, just as a historical character. And when I started hanging out with organized atheists 3 years ago, that's when I first discovered Jesus mythicism. And in some ways, I'm like, an atheist's atheist. I've written the first book to teach evolution to preschoolers. I've got a game in the works that teaches cladistics to kids. I've got an atheist blog. I organize atheist debates. But there are a lot of atheists that give me a lot of grief. They call me a fake atheist. They call me a wannabe Christian. They say I'm lying when I say I'm an atheist. And all that's because I say there was a historical Jesus. So I see this really strange effect in the atheist community that talking about historical Jesus is sort of like a heresy or a blasphemy. And people get really kind of nasty. I get personal insults over this. And so that makes me wonder, like, why is this such a big deal?
I'm very surprised, and it's amusing to me that you're talking about the atheist community as segregating people and saying, well, you're not a true atheist.
Isn't that weird?
Yeah, how could that be? I mean, if there was a historical Jesus,
yeah,
which we still haven't got into why I don't think that there was.
Yeah.
But if there was a historical Jesus, that is in no way a threat to anybody's position as far as being a skeptic. I mean, as far as
right.
Regardless of your position. I mean, okay, so if there was a first century faith healer,
yeah,
it's clear that this guy was not God for a whole lot of different reasons. For one, he didn't know what the smallest seeds were that were known by other farmers of his day. He didn't know what the season is for figs on a fig tree, for example. He actually said he went against his own Jewish laws by saying that you don't have to wash your hands, as the old Jewish tradition was.
Right.
You have to follow all of the old Mosaic laws to every jot and tittle, but except for where you don't have, he will work on the Sabbath, and he says you don't have to be circumcised and you don't have to wash your hands. So he makes up his own rules at the same time, and he thinks that nothing that a man takes into his mouth can defile him, even if it's broken glass, poison, LSD, infectious pathogens, whatever, because he thinks that the magic word.
I mean, he's clearly not God. He's clearly not some omniscient figure.
Absolutely right. This is not a guy that performed miracles. We know that the miracles are made up. We know that all of that he has so many other elements added to his story that were evidently taken from the stories of other gods and heroes, like the childhood escape that was adapted from Moses, that was in turn adapted from Sargon, and so forth.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so I mean, if you think there was a historical Jesus, fine.
Right.
I don't understand why there's an issue with that.
Well, let me ask you about that, because I have a theory for why people treat me that way. If it sounds surprising to you, it's really not surprising to me. So humans are biased. I think we can agree on that. Atheists are humans. Atheists are biased humans, just like anybody else.
Yeah.
We have these tribal instincts. We have biases against the people who are different from us, and we certainly have biases against people who hate us and people who lie about us and tell mean things about us, and that's what Christians do. So to me, it seems it's inconsistent for atheists to say that they're rational but then call me a fake atheist. It's inconsistent, but it's perfectly natural. It's perfectly predictable, because that's the way politics are. That's the way tribal politics are.
Yeah.
And so for me, this is a really interesting position where you and I can agree that it doesn't make you a fake atheist if you agree with the mainstream scholars on this topic. But boy, there's a bunch of very loud atheists who will take issue with that. If you ever want to see what that's like, go on an atheist forum and say, you think there probably was a historical Jesus, and see what kind of grief you get for that. So for me, what's exciting about this topic is it is an opportunity for us as atheists to confront the biases that the atheist community has and rise above them and show that we as atheists are able to recognize our own bias, not let it control us, and be more rational than, say, Christians or Muslims or what have you. So it's this crazy tribal political problem that I find interesting. That's what makes the topic worthwhile for me. Historically, it doesn't really matter whether there was a Jesus, but sort of for the soul of the atheist community, if we can't be rational about this topic, well, what does that say about us and our claim to be driven by evidence?
Yeah.
So that's my point.
Okay, you might want to check your camera because for whatever reason your screen went black. Yeah. Now, as far as I know how it is to have within the atheist community, as you say, when you can agree with somebody on 80% of so many things, and then you find out one disagreement. Okay, there's one thing, and for me, that's not a huge deal. I mean, there may be something that I find really objectionable, but I'm still going to be able to look at all of the things we agree on, and whether you are an ally in helping me achieve what I want our group to achieve, or the political standard or the recognition. I want us to be recognized as a demographic, a significant one.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, and the problem we have with that is, of course, religious people will vote exactly how they're told to vote, so they're very much sheep, and they all do exactly what they're told to do, and we don't. And one of the problems with that is that I see is once you have that one disagreement, and I mentioned this on stage at one point, I said, okay, here's a guy that I agree with 80% of everything that he just said, the guy that was on stage just ahead of me, but there's this one thing we disagree on, so now I must hate him and campaign against everything he ever does and slander him and call him a Nazi and every other thing I can do. Yeah. Because that's the way we tend to be.
Yeah. Taking sides.
And it's what you're talking about tribal politics.
That's right.
The strange thing is I've gotten way more grief over social political issues, which I consider to be trivial differences, things that aren't even a forefront of my interest at all. Yeah. But these are the things I go, well, I disagree with you on this one thing you said 4 years ago, and so I'm going to hound you about that.
Yeah.
Forever, and misrepresent you however I can in the process.
Yeah. No, when you were here in Seattle, I saw someone take you to task for some thing that you had said about the Marvel Comics universe or whatever, and it was like really strange that this guy agrees with you on 90% of what you say, but what he really wants to talk about is this one weird thing. Yeah. Right? And in fact, if you look at atheists, we are more disagreeable than average here in the States. We're less likely to go along with the crowd. We're more likely to, think for ourselves and be contrarian. And you just see that in all the arguments and infighting and whatever in the atheist community.
You might want to turn your camera off and then turn it back on because you're still not on camera.
Oh, is that right? Okay.
But I understand what you mean. And when people want to embrace rationality, they want to declare themselves rational.
That's right.
I mean, the least rational person I have ever met brags about how rational she is.
Yeah.
So
that's right. I would like us instead to accept that we are driven by emotions. That's what the new science on human nature says, that we're primarily driven by our emotions. And we should accept that and embrace that we're atheists. We can accept the science that says that, we're social apes who have gotten too big for our britches, but we're still driven by emotions. Okay, and I think we should accept that.
And I try to keep that at a minimum. I mean, I really appreciate that science is dispassionate.
Yeah,
You
me
don't
too.
get an emotional attachment to a position.
Yeah,
And on the synthesis thing, I don't have an emotional attachment. It it would really be fine if
yeah,
there was a historical Jesus.
yeah,
But the people, the historians, when
yeah,
everybody, this is the first thing everybody cites is all the number of historians who say that there was a Jesus. Well, of course there was a Jesus,
yeah,
because this person who was born into a Christian or Jewish family uh,
yeah,
was raised with this tradition, and so they were always taught that Jesus was a real person, and
yeah,
they've never had reason to question that.
yeah,
And they've had clues staring them in the face their whole life and somehow never noticed them. So they just think that, oh, you're going to say that Jesus never existed? Why don't you just dismiss everybody else too, from Pontius Pilate to Sophocles
right,
and everyone else,
right.
right? Because we can't conclusively prove that anybody existed. But of course, that's not what we're talking about.
Yeah, that's right.
So to get into part of my perspective, like I said, when we're talking about Paul, who could have created the entirety of Christianity as we know it today out of whatever little cult existed at that time. He could have manufactured all of it. If there was never a historical Jesus, he could have created one, although he didn't create one. He didn't give it a historicity.
So,
He's still talking about a spiritual character.
so that's one hypothesis. Let's talk about hypotheses. Um, in my view, what makes a hypothesis better than another hypothesis is that it has more explanatory power,
Mm-hmm.
explains more of the evidence, and leaves fewer questions open. I don't know if that rings a bell for you, but that's how I
Well, no,
judge hypothesis.
that's the reason that I'm mythicist. Exactly.
Right. Okay. So the right thing to do in that case is to look at two hypotheses and see
Okay.
which ones are most plausible.
Right. And so we always have difficulty changing our minds. And I started from the position that you're at now,
Yeah.
wherein, and that Richard Carrier was once at, where we believe that Jesus was this fanatical weirdo in the first
Yeah.
century. The guy with the nappy hair. I mean, there are some descriptions of him, right? As you said, the hillbilly with the accent, the bad
Yeah.
hair, the stupid things that he said. The clearly dishonest things that modern faith healers still do, like saying that you must renunciate all of your wealth and give it to me so that I can feed the poor. How many faith healers we still have playing that shtick,
Yeah.
right? So then get your money and get by.
Yeah.
So it's not a hard thing to accept that the possibility that happened. Okay, but we're not talking about possibilities. We're talking about something that has an explanation.
Yeah.
And so now we have, with the Jesus story, we have somebody that was born in two different places at two different times and raised in three different countries.
So, right. And I think you're totally right that historians look at those crazy stories and dismiss them as not part of the historical record. So you're talking about gospel Jesus, and gospel Jesus for sure is bunk. We can all agree on that, and historians all agree on that. And Christians hate the idea of historical Jesus. They fight it tooth and nail. Oh yeah, like go on Wikipedia, for example, on the Jesus page, and you'll see how hard Christians fight against the idea of historical Jesus.
I have never seen a Christian that fought against a historical Jesus.
You look at the talk page on the Jesus page on Wikipedia, and you will see Christians fighting the historical view of who Jesus was. You see that, and every page associated with a gospel or a biblical figure or Jesus or whatever, you will see Christians fighting the historical view. In the historical view, Jesus never claimed to be God. Right? In the historical view, the whole Gospel of John is bunk. Christians hate the historical Jesus. They have fought against it since it first sort of landed back in, I think, 1850 or something like that. So they've been, and in fact, Catholics are specifically forbidden from studying historical Jesus. It's it's been for 100 years, that's been off the table. It's not allowed because historical Jesus is such a challenge to the way people think, what Christians think Jesus is. So historians have not been supporting Christianity. They've been debunking Christianity with historical Jesus. Historical Jesus didn't claim to be God. Historical Jesus did not tell anyone to stop being Jewish. He did not give his apostles any sort of authority to start a church. He didn't start a theology. And, you know, if you look at what historians say about Jesus, it's the last thing that any Christian wants to hear, right? Oh, the Christmas story is bunk. The story of the three wise men is bunk, right? Like the resurrection was a vision, right? Like it's very common for people to have visions of dead people and of religious people. And so did Mary Magdalene have a vision of Jesus after he died? Sure, right? Doesn't prove anything. And so the historical Jesus is like the big, hairy enemy of Christianity. And it's weird to see atheists fighting the idea, because Christians want to say, don't listen to the historians, don't read the Encyclopedia Britannica, you should read the Gospels and use that as your guide for who Jesus was. And then atheists come along and say the same thing. Don't read Encyclopedia Britannica. Don't listen to the historians. We've got our own little pet idea of how the Jesus cult started, and that's what you should believe. Well, I don't think we should have a pet idea. I think we should just follow the evidence. I think Christians should follow the evidence and accept historical Jesus. I think atheists should follow the evidence and accept historical Jesus.
I think atheists should follow the evidence, and I see it as a contradiction if you're then also going to accept a historical Jesus if you're following the evidence.
Okay, exactly, and that's where we're at.
It's going to lead the other way.
So
did you turn your camera back on?
I did. You still don't see me?
No.
Okay. Well, I guess
it might show up in the live. It might show up for other people. It just isn't showing up for me. And maybe that's happening. I don't know. Anyway, I'm aghast that you're telling me that Christians typically, by your description, fight against the idea of a historical Jesus. I usually deal with, let's say, something less than a theologian, although everybody wants to say that they're a greater theologian than I am.
Yeah.
They argue that the Gospels are exactly verbatim correct. They don't challenge anything in it. That Jesus was born of a virgin.
Exactly.
And it's just like on The Simpsons, where Flanders says he believes every part of the Bible, including the parts that contradict the other parts. Well, that's the people that I'm talking about. They'll accept both genealogies, even though there are two different ones.
Exactly. And that's why they hate historical Jesus. That's why they hate the historians' view of who Jesus was. Because the historians say, all that stuff in the Gospel of John where Jesus claims to be the way and the truth and the life, that never happened.
Okay, so what you're saying, I just want to be clear because I misunderstood you before.
Yeah.
What you're saying is the thing that the Christians are upset about is not the idea that Jesus was an actual guy once upon a time.
That's right.
In the early, what you now recognize as the early first century. What they object to is the way the historians view that guy.
Right. They object to a historical treatment.
Okay. Right. My problem with Jesus as a historical person is that he wasn't one guy. That if you had a time machine and you could go back and find Jesus, you'd never find Jesus. But there are probably 3 or 4 Jesuses or Jesusi, and if you could bring all 4 of them, or I think 3, let's be conservative and say 3, bring all 3 of them up to the future, and none of the 3 would watch any of the movies we make about Jesus today, and none of them would recognize themselves and say, oh, this is about me. That wouldn't happen.
For sure, the historical Jesus would not recognize the things that Christians say about him. That is absolutely true. And I think that's one reason why I like this topic is people have been lying about this guy since before his corpse was cold. And so hardly anybody knows the real story. The Christians don't know the real story because they've been lying about him since the beginning. And atheists don't know the real story because they throw out all those lies and they throw out the historical kernel with it. So here's my challenge to you. If you think that there wasn't a historical Jesus, can you just give me a summary of how Christianity started, how it developed, what Paul's influence was, how Mark got written, how Matthew got written, how Luke got written, how John got written, and why Christianity was the way it was? Can you just give me a narrative summary of how that all happened? And we'll see how plausible that is.
Yeah, we had a pre-existent cult, and I'll give you the evidence of that in a moment. We had a pre-existent cult, and we had the early Gnostics. I mean like before before the Christian version of the Gnostics. We had the Docetics and the Ebionites, and I can't remember the name of this other group, but they were talking about conflicting ideas of a Jesus character, and one that was supposed to be just a human savior.
What year was that? I'm sorry, I'm not going to interrupt you. You just give me the whole story, and then we'll go back to it.
Yeah. Okay. I couldn't give you a year, but we know that it wasn't a guy that was born in what Christians would think of as the year 0 or the year 1.
Sure.
Okay. And like I said, I'll get to that in a moment. So we had a cult that already existed. And there was conflicting versions of it, so nobody can agree on what their character is. I mean, so you have the Ebionites who say that Jesus was only a human.
Yep.
He's a prophet. We have the Docetics who say that he's only a god, and
Yep.
he's entirely spiritual.
Yep.
And any pretense to humanity is merely an illusion. And
That's right.
And so we have where people try to blend these things together, and you've got a lot of people making excuses and trying to just the apologetics that we still see today. When you ask somebody who owned the potter's field and how did Judas die,
yeah,
then you're going to get all kinds of backflips to try to justify how there's these two contradictions that
yeah.
both can't be correct.
Can you keep going on how this cult developed and how it left the traces?
I am. But anyway, so you have people doing their apologetics. And so when you have a person, let's say you have a person who is said to existed, or maybe even actually existed, who was born in Nazareth, or maybe he was born somewhere else. Maybe he's in Galilee, but he's supposed to be born in Nazareth, or maybe we have to come up with an excuse for how he's really accounted for here when he was born here, or his followers say he was born here, but the prophecy that he was supposed to be born here. So what is our excuse that we have to make up? And
exactly.
So you start coming up with the erroneous census that never happened, and then
exactly.
suddenly you've got to migrate to Egypt to fulfill some other bullshit excuse.
Exactly, bullshit.
So you start coming up with all of this nonsense. But at some point there was a necessity to make this an actual guy, and I don't know how they come together with making it an actual guy. But it seems that at the very beginning of actual Christianity as we know it today. I mean, when you look at the church fathers, like right at the end of the 1st century, beginning of the 2nd century, you have people that are one like Paul, for example, who never talks about a historical Jesus, and then Justin Martyr, one of the early church fathers, who also details how Jesus cannot be the historical Jesus. He can't be the guy that lived a generation or two before. His description, Justin Martyr goes into this long diatribe about, comparing Jesus. And then, mind you, this is early 2nd century.
Yeah.
So Justin Martyr is one of the church fathers, and he is describing Jesus as a ripoff of all of the pre-existing pagan gods. And he's talking about how Satan counterfeited Jesus and copied him into Hercules and Dionysus and all the Hellenistic gods and the Egyptian gods and Sumerian gods and so forth.
Okay, before we get to Justin Martyr, there's Paul and the 4 Gospels. So those are an important part of the narrative that you skipped. Can you cover those?
I was.
Okay.
So at some point, as I said, you have the apologetics where you have to start making up excuses to justify things. And you have people who want to believe that they're not into the spiritual Jesus. They're into the old Ebionite concept of a Jesus that walks among us.
Yeah.
So now they have to come up with some kind of way of blending these two. You've got these two disparate ideas, both kind of focusing on the same character. So somebody comes up with a story, and it is not written by Matthew or by Mark.
Of course not. That's right.
But, of course, creationists all think that these are eyewitness accounts. None of them give any indication that they are eyewitnesses accounts, or even necessarily that they even could be eyewitnesses accounts.
Exactly. No, that's
written as stories. Okay, and not stories from a first-hand account. They're just third-person tales. So at no point does any of these gospels say, "And I saw."
That's right.
Or me, and none of that happened. So what you have is a reconciliation of contradictions.
Yeah.
This is like where, you have Isaiah 45, you have God saying that, I created good and evil and there is none beside me. And then Jesus comes along and says, I sit beside God. And God says, you shall have no other gods before me. And then Jesus says that the only way to get to the Father is but through me. So now, how do you reconcile these contradictions? Because now Jesus has put himself in front of God, at least according to the gospel. So now we have to come up with more excuses, more apologetics,
Sure.
to more
Yeah.
backflip and,
Yeah.
and logical contortions to try to figure out how we can reconcile this. So that's where the gospels came from. You have the first of them, and there's a blend there too, because as I said, if the Markan Passion narrative is actually based retrospectively on something that Josephus wrote centuries later and then was added, or a century later and then was added in, that kind of makes sense if they're talking about Jesus, Ben, Ananias, and because there was another place where they talk about where Josephus, who talks about like 19 different Jesusii, Josephus mentions James, brother of Jesus the Anointed, right? And so the Christians all come up and say, well, that's our Jesus. That's clearly our Jesus, except that it's talking about Jesus of Damnias, which is definitely a different person, but the Christians are still claiming that that's their guy. Well, if we know it's not their guy and they're claiming that it is their guy, well, then what about Jesus ben Ananias that was down there in Mark?
Yeah.
And the other Jesus, the unnamed Jesus that Josephus mentions among the three people on the crosses that he takes down, which is mirrored in Luke, where Luke is telling about the same story from the opposite perspective, as if let's imagine for a moment that Luke was an eyewitness account. Well, then so was Josephus an eyewitness account. They're looking at each other and telling the same story from two different angles.
So that's not how I remember Josephus, and I would encourage everyone listening to go look into Josephus. The references to Jesus are pretty short and pretty easy to read. So if you remember Josephus one way, I remember another, I would just encourage our listeners to look it up. So why? Okay, so I asked you for a hypothesis for how everything started. You feel like you're done?
No, because
then keep going. Yeah, please keep going.
All right, so you had this reconciliation, where people want to have, where they want to blend the Ebionite and the Docetic, they have the Gnostic thing, and put their spiritual and their corporeal Jesus into the same character. So you create these stories, and you have this cult, which is all based on visions. So nothing actually happens. I mean, look at Paul, for example. They celebrate every dream as if it had significance, every hallucination, everything you can make yourself see.
And they speak in tongues, right? And they prophesy, and they listen to angels, and they do all sorts of crazy stuff. Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm embarrassed to see my background wasn't the standard Christian perspective that a lot of other people are familiar with. I was more the neo-pagan occultist, but I was also practicing transcendental meditation and things like this. And you do the same thing in every one of these kind of spiritual cult-like behaviors as you do in Christianity. You are trying to make yourself see just beyond what your eyes can see. In other words, make stuff up.
Yeah.
And so when these people are talking about these visions, and that's all Paul is doing, is he's talking about visions as if they really happened. And so he expresses that he never actually saw Jesus in real life. But then later in the same book, he himself says, have I not seen Jesus? Well, no. But because you already said you did. And now you're seeing, because it's in a vision, because you can't tell visions from reality.
Right.
But
and the whole Gospel of John, for example, whole Gospel of John, they practically come out and say, oh, we heard this stuff in prayer. Jesus told us this while we were praying. So they practically tell you that it's not historical.
Right.
I totally agree.
So the important thing I was mentioning about Justin Martyr, where Justin Martyr goes through this list of pagan gods and acknowledges that Jesus is a ripoff of all of them, but he posits that Satan created all of these other gods as a copy of Jesus.
Yeah.
So Jesus, and I want to specify, he does not imply or evidently even imagine that Satan is a time traveler.
Yeah.
So Satan didn't go back in time and create these gods from centuries, many centuries before Jesus, and then make them duplicates of him. He made them he made the old gods duplicates of Jesus after Jesus, which means that Justin Martyr is not talking about a guy who lived a generation or two before him. It's not somebody his grandfather might have met.
Yeah.
Justin Martyr puts Jesus as prophesied in Psalm 19. He says that Jesus was literally the Son.
Yeah.
And so Justin Martyr could have known people who knew Jesus if Jesus was an actual historical person.
Yeah.
He was that close.
Yeah.
And yet he thinks Jesus lived centuries before the old gods.
So,
and that damns the whole historical Jesus thing right there.
Okay. Is that your hypothesis? Have you?
Yeah.
Okay. So, you started out with the cult already in progress. So you never talked about how the cult was founded. Now, this was a doomsday cult, right?
I don't know that it started that way. It would have been 1st century BC or 2nd century BC, and I'm leaning for 1st century BC.
So what's the evidence? I've never heard anybody provide any evidence that the Jesus cult started before around AD 30. So what's your evidence that the Ebionites or the Docetics or whatever were in the 1st century BC or 2nd century BC?
We already have, by the time Paul starts writing.
Yeah.
By the time he starts writing.
Yeah.
There's already an established religion with
exactly. That's right.
hierarchy.
So he clearly didn't start it. He clearly didn't start it. Like, it was already there.
Right. So it's already well established. More than you would think it could have been if it had actually been a guy who lived 30 years earlier.
Well, I mean, I'm reading the same books and I come to an opposite conclusion, so that's pretty subjective.
Okay, how do you construct this entire hierarchy in just 30 years with no mass transit or mass communication at all?
I don't know what hierarchy you're talking about. So
you have the administrative levels of the church. You have all of these office positions.
I don't know what you're. Okay, so now you're describing a very different. You're describing a very different early church from what the mainstream historians describe.
I'm talking about what Paul himself described.
So if you look at Paul, he never talks to anybody as having official office. Nobody has an office. Nobody has a named office.
But wrong.
The churches don't have priests. They don't have people leading them. There are no bishops.
Does the audio work? All of what you just said is wrong. Paul has an established hierarchy of office positions within the church. He does, in fact, say all the things you just said he didn't say.
I think that's another great thing for our listeners to go look up. Right? If you look at the early church, there were no official leaders. There was no liturgy.
There were bishops and deacons. He names those specifically. So already established.
And who were those bishops?
He does. I don't know that he names all of the bishops. Does it?
No. But what role did they play?
Their administrative offices within the church.
Okay.
What other level they have? Why would they need one?
So a bishop.
Mm-hmm.
So the bishops that we know today are modeled after Roman authoritarian rule. And they started to appear in Christianity around AD 100. And by AD 150, there were bishops all throughout Christendom. But for the 1st century, there were no bishops the way you and I think of a bishop. Okay. Bishop means overseer.
Why does Paul describe it then?
I'll get right. That's a really good question. So here's what Paul said.
He exists.
If you look at the 1st century.
He not only says they already exist, they have existed. They pre-exist Paul.
So these
religion with offices.
Yeah. Well,
writing.
Okay. So every church congregation, because there was no official hierarchy, there was no church hierarchy, every congregation was led by elders. You just get a bunch of the old men together and they make decisions. There's no one leader. There's no ritual that turns you into a priest. Presbyter means elder, priest means elder, bishop means superintendent, and those two terms are used interchangeably. Deacon means servant. So what you had was the elders of a congregation, not any particular office, nothing official, but just a loose conglomeration of these are the people who are leading the congregation. And then they had deacons, servants to do what have you. But there was nothing like a bishop to tell people what to do. No one could describe a liturgy or define scripture or explain a theology. It was all just sort of catch as catch can.
They did.
Paul?
Yes.
Exactly. That's a really good point. And I'm glad you brought that up. Is that Paul?
You keep saying that Paul didn't say, or that these things didn't exist that Paul said existed before him.
So Paul showed up and he provided a theology
that he said all pre-existed him.
If you look at the creed before Paul, it doesn't talk about the crucifixion.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't have to, because as I said, if Paul is writing at the time that he is supposed to have written, and the Mark and Passion narrative is actually based on something Josephus said, and another guy who didn't even live in that century, Jesus ben Ananias, well, then it makes perfect sense. The explanative thing is that, okay, well, that's why Paul didn't mention the crucifixion, because it wasn't part of the theology yet. It wasn't part of the theology until Josephus' time.
Well, hold on. Paul mentions the crucifixion. That's his big point. Maybe you need to read Romans again, but Paul's big point is the crucifixion. The people before Paul did not make a big deal about the crucifixion.
He does say that he was crucified, but he doesn't give any details about that. It's not like the story that we have. We know that everybody was getting crucified. We know that the Romans were crucifying a lot of people. So the fact that this character gets crucified by the most common means may or may not imply that he was a historical character or was just a common means of death at that time.
Right. So what I'm saying is, before Paul, there was no real reference to the crucifixion, and then Paul came along and made up the blood magic thing, and that's where you get the crucifixion is, Jesus shed blood for, a pure soul taking on the curse of humanity. But that did not exist before Paul. So before Paul, there was no scripture, there was no defined liturgy. Paul does not mention bishops. I think maybe we can look that up. They are mentioned in other places, but when you read Paul's letters, he's writing to churches. He never says, "Hey, Mr. Bishop, this is what you should do." He never says, "You guys should all listen to what your bishops tell you to do." There's even in the church that he set up himself, there's no authority to tell people what to do. So you have these weird factions, like you said, the Docetists, who say weird things, and nobody can tell them to shut up because there's no church hierarchy. There's no authority to tell people no.
And yet, he says, well, no, he doesn't talk about a single hierarchy. I'll grant you that. As a matter of fact, his situation, the situation he describes, is much more disparate than what we know. Because while I was talking about a different collection of Jesuses or Jesii, right? And so we have a composite character. That the explanative evidence is that there's a composite character because we have people, and we have Paul himself, who says not only that the church is established and already divided, because there's different people in different areas.
That's right.
That are all preaching this according to vision, and they're coming up with different ideas. But it's not just people that are coming up with different ideas, because he says that there are angels who are wandering amongst people who are also telling stories about Jesus, and they're talking about different Jesii.
Yeah, he loves angels.
So how the hell do we get now? Just think of this. I've got some guy who apparently I don't know if he had a stroke or if he saw lightning strike. I think a stroke is more likely, given the descriptions I've read about Paul. I have this character who believes in visions and had a stroke, and now he thinks he's heard the voice of God that the other people around him apparently didn't share that experience. Or I have an angel, right, who's going to tell me about a different Jesus. Which one of these people am I gonna buy? I mean, if I can verify that the guy is actually an angel, I'm probably going to side with him. But the point is, we have multiple angels
Yeah.
Talking about multiple Jesuses. So if
Yeah.
we're talking about the problem with Jesus being a historical character is there's more than one Jesus, and we have all these different conflicting stories. We've got 4 gospels that contradict each other, which are the 4 we kept out of the 16 we know about, right? Or maybe there were
Well, that's not exactly fair. You make that out to as if those 4 are not special, but those 4 are different from the other gospels.
granted, those four are different, and all of them are different. But
So they're earlier than the other gospels, and the synoptic gospels agree with each other better. And in fact, Mark precedes Josephus. When you talk about Mark and Luke being based on Josephus, Josephus comes after those gospels have already been
at the same time.
Well, I would encourage our listeners to look it up and find out for themselves what order those books are written in. So on the topic of Jesus, it's true that there are lots of reports of people named Jesus because it was a very common male name. It was not an angel's name. Angels at that time had names like Michael, and no boys were named Michael. Angels were Gabriel or Uriel, and Jesus was a boy's name. So the idea that there would be a celestial being named Jesus doesn't make any sense. It's a man's name.
Why would we have? Just think about this. We're talking about explanative hypotheses.
Yeah, that's right.
Hypotheses. By the hypothesis that Jesus was a historical character in 30 CE.
Yeah.
I don't have an explanation for how we have multiple angels wandering around telling stories of different Jesuses. Now, by my hypothesis, that's accounted for. By yours, it is not. My hypothesis accounts for the fact that Justin Martyr says that Jesus is older than all the old gods. Your hypothesis does not account for that.
So you're reading Justin Martyr differently from how historians do. There's just a whole bunch of points.
I mentioned at the beginning that historians just take what they've been told that Jesus was a real character. They never question that. They don't even notice. And I've actually seen a historian do this where they read that passage of Justin Martyr that I just read to you.
Yeah.
That word told you about, and they read that and they interpret it that Jesus or that Justin Martyr believes that Satan is a time traveler. Nowhere in that passage does Justin Martyr imply that Satan went back in time. Nobody ever wrote anything about going back in time.
But Satan could have known ahead of time what Jesus is. There was prophecy that Jesus was going to come.
We can't go there either because
ahead of time.
We can't go there either because even God can't see what the hell he's doing in advance because he keeps making mistakes and having to wipe the slate and start over again.
If you're saying that Justin Martyr would have to be inconsistent to think that there had been a historical Jesus, lots of people are inconsistent. The Gospels are inconsistent. Inconsistency it's normal.
If we're talking about which of our hypotheses has explanative power, I'm showing you mine does, and you're showing me yours doesn't.
So let me go back to what you just said about the historians. You're basically saying that all the historians who have looked into this question are just fools. You're not even addressing their evidence.
Why would you do that? I've noticed you jump into hyperbole, and that's not appropriate.
You just said that
debate with Carrier, for example. Carrier mentioned that the only peer-reviewed work prior to his was in the 1920s.
Only peer-reviewed book on this topic, yeah.
Right, exactly, was in the 1920s. And so now he's written a recent one. So if you want to catch up, then you should read the recent work and not the stuff that's 80 years old. And you got a stickler on that and went hyperbole on him to say, oh, you're saying all the historians are 100 years behind you. No, you're not understanding what I'm saying. And you're jumping into hyperbole on it. I'm not saying that every historian is a fool. I did explain that historians are told, they were raised to believe that there was a historical Jesus, that Jesus was a real guy. They never even questioned that. They read the passage. And then because they've got this preconceived notion that Jesus was historic and he lived at this time, and they've got it all mapped out where Jesus exists in this frame of space and time. And then they read this passage from Justin Martyr, and the only way that they can interpret that is they don't question what they were told since childhood, that maybe Jesus didn't exist in this time frame. Maybe he was earlier or something like that. No, they jump right to Justin Martyr is assuming that Satan is a time traveler. That is not supported at all, but it's the only way they can reconcile if they won't let go of the idea that Jesus existed between 0 and 30 CE.
So your explanation for why the historical consensus is that there was a Jesus, your explanation for that consensus is that historians never questioned their premises and they just take it for granted, and that all the historians who have looked at this situation, they can't see what you see because they're too biased.
I wouldn't put it that way, but I have actually seen these historians that we're talking about write things to that effect, where I've actually seen one of the historians said, well, everybody knows Jesus was a historical character, so there's no point in even arguing it. Tell me that's not a bias.
I mean,
just assuming everybody knows.
I'm agreeing that there is some bias out there for sure. There's some bias.
And then among these historians very often cite their own consensus.
Yeah.
And the consensus they're citing is guys who say that there's no point in arguing it because everybody knows this.
And so
it's circular.
So atheist historians, Jewish historians, they all share this same bias, and that's why they can't see things the way you do.
Even Bart Ehrman.
Yeah.
It's the same things that I'm talking about.
Yeah.
And even Bart Ehrman cited his own consensus at one point.
Yeah. And so,
yes.
So, yeah. So, and that, I think that that's right. I think that the only way that you can explain the historical consensus is by a massive amount of bias. Right?
It is admitted formally, publicly, and in writing. Yes.
So yeah, clearly between you and the mainstream historians, the difference between the two of you is one side or the other has to be very biased. There's no other explanation for how you can be so involved with what the mainstream.
Let's work this out now.
Yeah.
Going for explanative hypothesis again.
Yeah.
Given this data, Justin Martyr's declaration that Satan created all these counterfeits.
Yeah.
All right. And implies in no way that Satan is a time traveler. He actually thinks that Jesus is in Psalms 19. So we're talking about Jesus already wandering around as Jesus, not as
Jesus
Yahweh.
is immortal, right? That's right. Jesus existed from the get-go, and yeah, exactly.
But as Jesus now. So no, Jesus's incarnation includes Old Testament stories.
Yeah, and Paul talked about that too.
We're not talking about a guy that was born in.
Paul talked about Christ existing and helping the Hebrews when they were wandering in the desert. That's right.
Right. So we're not talking about a guy that was born in the 1st century. We're talking about a guy who was already born many centuries earlier, according to what.
Born. I mean, he existed. It's not clear that he was born.
The story of Jesus, the virgin birth, for example, is duplicated by Satan. So we know that the virgin birth is part of the old. Not the 1st century. So according to Justin Martin, the virgin birth was many centuries earlier. So when a historian says, there's no point in discussing this, everybody who thinks Jesus every Jesus mythicist is biased and out of their mind or unsubstantiated. Everybody knows there was a historical Jesus, and there's no reason to even discuss this anymore. Is that a valid argument, or is that bias?
Well, I'm no historian, and so what I would say is, I don't follow what they are saying. What I say is, the most plausible narrative that anyone has come up with is the mainstream historical narrative.
And the reasons I just gave you show that it is not, and that it can't be. Your hypothesis does not account for the things that I just brought up.
The Justin Martyr bit.
Not just that, other things too. We went through quite a list of things.
There's hardly any of those things. Okay.
So let's ignore Justin Martyr for the moment. Since you can't deal with that, we'll go to something else. The multiple angels who already, prior to Paul's very first letter, right, we already have multiple angels talking about multiple Jesuses, not just one Jesus. Paul himself says it's not one guy, that it's several different Jesuses.
What can you name that chapter and verse?
Well, it's Thessalonians, and it's not very long, and it's pretty early into it. But yeah, he warns that there are not just other people talking about other Jesuses. There's angels walking amongst us, talking about other Jesus. Now, the only way that an angel is going to communicate, obviously, there's not a guy with wings who shows up and knocks at your. Can you imagine answering the door? There's two angels. We'd like to talk to you about you. That would be beautiful, but that's not what's happening. We're talking about people who believe in visions.
Yeah.
So they're all dreaming up, literally dreaming
up. They're coming up with all sorts of crazy stuff. That's right.
Right. They're dreaming up their own Jesuses, and now they're imagining that angels are talking to them.
So that's right.
Describing it. So everybody has different ideas. They're all conflicting with each other. And all of this predates Paul.
Clearly a lot of that predates Paul. And here's why. Here's why there are all those crazy ideas about who Jesus was. It's because there was no church hierarchy. There were no priests or bishops to tell people what to believe or not to believe. There was no official theology. There was no scripture. So you have this cult that has no leader. All doomsday cults are centered around a charismatic leader. But if you look at the cult that Paul joined, there's no charismatic leader leading that cult. There's nobody to tell people what to do. There's no one to tell people what you have to do to stay a Christian, or how you kick people out, or what, even Paul has to explain sort of how you do the liturgy and whatever, because there was no leadership. And why was there no leadership? Because the leader had been killed. Whenever you find a doomsday cult with no leader, it's because the leader was killed. So David Koresh here in the States, he was killed, and his doomsday followers that survived didn't know what to do next because they didn't have their charismatic leader left. And if you look at John the Baptist, he was killed. His followers didn't know what to do because their charismatic leader was killed. And so you look at the Jesus cult, and it looks like a doomsday cult whose charismatic leader has been killed.
Yeah, and Jesus himself is a copy of John the Baptist. And you have the story of John the Baptist, where John the Baptist surrenders his own importance to his readers, to his fellowship. Exactly. He surrenders his own importance to Jesus.
Yeah. He was
obviously this is not a historical thing that happened. This is obviously a literary tool.
So what we're saying is,
for John the Baptist to get his audience. Now, this is a literary character now. John the Baptist actually exists. I don't have a problem with that. But John the Baptist is now in a story doing something John the Baptist wouldn't have done.
Exactly.
He recognizes Jesus as the new replacement and surrenders his audience to this Jesus character.
Exactly.
Entirely literary, never really happened.
Right. And why doesn't that appear in Mark?
Because my hypothesis incorporates the same information as yours does, that there was no central leadership. As I said, it begins with all of these disparate ideas, where somebody has a spiritual savior and somebody has a physical savior, and then they start they're telling similar stories, so it integrates into the same guy.
And what you're saying is that there was this cult, but for some reason there were no leaders of the cult.
Yeah, and it's not a terribly mysterious thing. It's a mystery cult, so it's not terribly mysterious that there's no leader.
I'm glad that you brought up a mystery cult. So mystery cults have a mystery, and a mystery is the secret thing that you will learn when you get to the final initiation chamber. Mystery cults had a liturgy, they had priests, they had steps of initiation that you would go through. They had rules for what you had to do to join. So it's true that Paul added a bunch of sort of mystery religion stuff to it, but the cult that Paul joined is nothing like a mystery cult. They didn't even have a mystery to reveal. They didn't, because they had no theology. They didn't have an understanding of why Jesus had been crucified on the cross.
Right, and it was centuries later before they really even established that.
Well, Paul established that.
No, because you still had centuries later, they're still arguing over whether Jesus is a created figure or a divine figure or just a person.
Yeah, but Paul got Christianity to put the crucifixion, make the crucifixion be a big deal.
Paul was the first person to make Christianity, I don't know, notable, or maybe he was the first person to note it. So nobody had historically heard of Christianity before him. But I wouldn't say that he unified anything. He was complaining that it wasn't unified.
Yeah, and I think if you look at, for example, the John the Baptist cult, there's no historical record of it since before the Gospels or Josephus. So same thing.
Giving. which you say is implausible, is the very one that Paul himself describes. So we know that that was the case.
You broke up for a little bit. What was that?
You were saying that that my description of having all of these people with their little disparate ideas, all in conflict with each other, that this was not plausible. Yet this is exactly what Paul was describing.
Yeah, so I think that shows that the leader, the charismatic leader of the cult, had been killed, and that's why the cult did not have unity. Whereas when cults are invented, like Mithras, they are unified because the people that invent them set themselves up as the leaders, and they have a hierarchy, and they're the bosses. And you look at the early Christian cult, and it looks like the David Koresh cult after he was killed, or it looks like the John the Baptist cult after he was killed, right?
Well, by your own admission earlier in this conversation, you said that if you were to go back and find the historical GZI, that no one would recognize themselves in any of their modern theology, right? In all the accounts of Christianity today, the Jesus that you're looking for wouldn't recognize himself as the Jesus that they're looking for. Importantly, it wasn't just one Jesus. Even if there was a guy on which any of this was based, he was not alone. There was not just one guy.
Well, so that's a really popular opinion. I don't see any particular evidence for it. If you look at the sort of the
Damnius versus Jesus, Ben Ananias, and a half a dozen others.
Yeah, Jesus was a really popular name, but
which is also being adopted by Christians, insisting that is our guy, even when historians say no, this can't be because this guy lived 100 years later. But the Christians are claiming that guy.
So the Christians debated a lot about who Jesus was, what it meant for Jesus to be divine, what it meant for him to be human, but they did not debate what era he was born in. They might have gotten off a little bit, but they had that pretty well down.
Yeah, except that it's not mentioned by Paul, and Justin Martyr obviously thought it was centuries earlier.
Well, you're inferring some things from that Justin Martyr thing that I don't know that I would follow you on, but
I don't see how else you could read it.
I mean, it's perfectly plausible that you and I can look at the same text and understand it differently.
If Jesus was born in the 1st century, right, then how is his virgin birth copied no less than 500 years earlier by a different god? As well as the wine and the mysteries and all of this going back to Dionysus, which is minimum 500 years earlier.
Yeah. So what you're saying is,
and this is true of all the old gods. This is true of Hercules, right? Justin Martyr saying that Satan copied Hercules from Jesus. You going to tell me that Hercules was born in the 1st century?
Well, what I think I already talked about what my explanation is for that, and maybe you don't remember, but
so please give me that explanation.
But for example, the Christians believed that the virgin birth was predicted in the Old Testament.
Yeah, but they so grossly misread Isaiah 7 that
I know, right? It's a gross misreading, but that's what they believed.
Have you ever talked to a Christian about this when you point out what the flaw with that is?
Yes. Yeah.
Isn't it embarrassing watching?
And again, that's why Christians hate historical Jesus. That's why Christians are so dead set against the historical Jesus. So seeing Jesus as a historical figure, like what Pope Benedict said was, Jesus explodes all historical categories, because if you try to look at Jesus from a historical perspective, it turns out he's not the God-man that the Gospels make him out to be. So yeah, you're exactly right. The whole Isaiah thing is a great example of why Christians hate historical treatment of Jesus.
Yeah, I'm betting any Christian that sees this is going to take offense to that and insist that Jesus was a historical character, exactly the way the Gospel.
They will say that he existed in history, but they will deny the historical account of who Jesus was.
Now, earlier in this conversation, you said something about how I'm able to see things no one else can see, as if I wasn't actually seeing these things. I justified what I'm actually seeing is really there.
Yeah.
And I did give you some explanation of how other people will gloss over that, or maybe just not account for it. Right?
The Justin Martyr thing you're talking about.
Yeah. and that how the preconceived notion will just read right over that and won't even recognize that. Wait, Dionysus was,
Yeah.
500 or 600 years earlier, and how are all these things? How could these copies have happened? No, they don't think about this. And I had another point about this about Christian theology, but I got sidetracked and now I forgot what it was. But they make the similar kind of excuses. They will read. No, I know what it was. When I suggested that Jesus was a faith healer,
Yeah.
that he was trying to get people to donate money so he can feed them with it, right? And they're saying, well, Jesus wasn't a faith healer because they believe in the gospel. Don't you read the gospel? Didn't you hear what it said?
Clearly a faith healer, right?
Look at prosperity gospel. Does nobody practicing prosperity gospel remember anything Jesus said about rich man will not get into heaven?
That's right.
The camel through the eye.
Exactly. So suddenly I'm not able to hear you. Yeah, and
okay.
There you go. Now you're back again.
All right. Well, this probably be a good. Unless you got something interesting to throw in, I'm going to give you an opportunity to close, unless you want to take it in a whole nother direction. I think we've been on this well enough, if you like.
Yeah. So the only thing that I would like to talk about that we didn't, and also I'll just mention it briefly, is that if you look at the Gospels, a lot of it is direct, right? Like there's a lot of the Gospels is just like you talked about the fig tree stuff or whatever. A lot of it is just focus. And Thomas Jefferson said that you can pick out the sort of the true sayings of Jesus. You can pick those out of the Gospel like picking diamonds out of a dung heap. Okay, so if you look at A.G. Wells, he's a mythicist, but he said there must have been some preacher whose preaching is behind the Sermon on the Mount. Like there's go the extra mile, turn the other cheek, blessed are the hungry. Like there's some sort of counterculture genius who is responsible for that. Whether it was this historical Jesus or not, there's somebody of some historical or religious magnitude who generated that material. And Carrier says the same thing, that there was some sort of counterculture Jesus who was behind the sayings that are attributed to Jesus. So if we can agree that there was some sort of preacher who generated this stuff, the easiest explanation for who that preacher was is that he was a hillbilly exorcist from Galilee named Jesus.
And since he was evidently multiple people, that this is also coming from multiple sources, and they're describing people who were born in different times under different circumstances in different countries and so forth, with repeating the stories that we know were adopted from other heroes to come before him, then this is very definitely a composite character, not a single historical figure.
So I don't see any particular evidence that he's a composite figure. It's true that contradictory stories were told about him, but you can tell contradictory stories about an individual. Okay. And if there's a composite figure, then the question is, name those composite figures. Like, one was an exorcist, and one was a preacher, and one was a cult leader? Like, that's a really interesting historical account.
And
but
you're not really listening to what I'm saying. You're getting defensive and going for hyperbole again.
Okay.
Because you'd already agreed that the elements that were taken from Dionysus, originally Jesus, those were Dionysus. I mean, Justin Martyr described a whole bunch of pagan gods that Jesus was evidently based on. Now, are you going to deny that that Dionysus had the wine in his mysteries before Jesus? That Dionysus said that he was the fruit of the vine. That Dionysus was.
But historians accept all that.
What?
Historians accept all that. None of that contradicts the historical Jesus account.
So, but they're not what Jesus did. These are not things that Jesus. So there's already. Even if we start with a single historical character.
Yeah.
Have a wealth of fictional characters whose stories are compiled on top of him.
That's right. That's exactly right.
And so what I'm talking about is We don't have one historical character, because we have people arguing over whether Jesus of Damnius and Jesus of Ben and Onias, for example, among several, are all incorporated in this. So we have writings that are taken from John the Baptist, for example. Now we've integrated him. We just stole his story and had Jesus duplicate it. And we have all these contradictions written in that wouldn't exist if Jesus was a single person.
So that's a stretch that I guess I don't agree. It's possible for there to be contradictions even if there is a single person.
Fine if we don't agree.
Yeah, exactly. But I'm not a fake atheist, right? I'm glad we agreed on that from the very beginning, right? Like, it's perfectly fine for an atheist to agree with the mainstream account.
Ultimately, like I said, I used to believe that Jesus was a historical character.
Yeah.
A number of reasons why I no longer can.
Yeah.
And the hypothesis that I started with, which was the one you presented, I now see holes in that can't be reconciled anymore. So, I mean, I have to go with the idea that Jesus is a composite character. Now, I'm not going to go so far as to say that he was entirely made up.
No.
But I will say that he was evidently initially made up. So even if we do have, at some point, we have like pre-existing ideas, taken from all these other gods, taken from the Ebionites and the Docetics, taken from the first century BC.
Yeah.
Now we've glommed some of those onto maybe one guy, right? And now we've added stories from this other guy and this other guy, and now we've just mixed up our GZI.
Yeah.
That's what I think we've got going on here.
I would love to see hard evidence for that.
Well, I gave you a hypothesis that accounted for things and covered things yours could not. You gave me elements from your hypothesis that my hypothesis also accounts for. So, in my perspective, the mythical position wins.
I mean, I totally believe that from your perspective, your position wins. Yes, that's totally true.
It does.
I
doubt that you understand why it does. Or you said that you.
I'd love to see some evidence that the Docetics and the Ebionites existed in the 1st century BC or the 2nd century BC. I'd love to see some evidence for that, for example.
Mm-hmm.
I'd love to see some explanation for why there was a cult with no leadership, why there was a cult with no liturgy, no scripture, no theology. Like, invented cults tend to have that stuff nailed down.
Right.
So
we have the first pre-Jesus probably existed in the 1st century BC, and I can't remember what this guy was. Oh, I wish I'd been able to pull up all these notes, because I mean, that's a discussion like that's going to have to be researched, so we all have
yeah.
We have to have our writings available, because I can't pull it from memory.
Fair enough. Right, and so then there's no way for us to come to an agreement because we don't have the evidence to share. So that's.
Well, I gave evidence that is accounted for by my hypothesis that is not accounted for in yours. You gave evidence that is accounted for by my hypothesis as well as yours.
What do you think is your killer argument that I can't account for? Well, or that historians can't account for? Because I'm not a historian. I'm just I'm just trying to summarize what historians say.
When you said that Paul never said that there was a structure of a church, when Paul clearly said that there was a structure of a church, when you said that when you want to, your hypothesis is that Jesus was a singular individual who lived only a couple generations before Paul, or a generation before Paul, and Paul himself is describing a multiplicity of GZI that are being shared by all these different sources, including visions and real people in a church with a structure, although it's already. Although everybody's making up their own story. So, and then Justin Martyr, of course, going back even further, because the first attempt we have to put Jesus into history appears to be Justin Martyr, where he puts it centuries too far early. So.
Okay. I don't. Maybe we don't have time to address those, but thanks for being clear on what you think are your killer arguments. Should I field those, or you think we're kind of done?
If you think you can field them, you're welcome to, but I think we're kind of done.
Okay. Well, so for the Paul bit, he does not describe any bishops or priests. He talks about apostles and brothers and whatever, but there's no hierarchy.
He does, in fact, say bishops and deacons.
That's in Acts. That's in Titus. But it's not Paul. So, and when he says bishops, it's overseers, it's superintendents. It's not bishops the way we think of bishops. It's the same thing as elders. So, the Justin Martyr thing, I'm not familiar with. You don't like my explanation for how Satan could do things in advance, and that's fine. We interpret that differently. For sure.
Is there any precedent for the concept of time travel anywhere near Justin Martyr's time, anywhere near second century?
So,
is there even a possibility that Justin Martyr could have been thinking about a time traveling Satan?
The explanation I offered didn't have anything to do with time travel. It had to do with Satan knowing in advance what kind of stuff was going to happen with Jesus. So the other thing is, Mark is the first work to put Jesus in a historical context. That's well before Justin Martyr. You haven't talked about the Gospels, and if you look at the Gospels, it's pretty easy to see a historical figure there under the layers of legends. And so I wish we had talked more about the Gospels, because those are a lot closer to the start of the church and are a lot more informative than Justin Martyr. And I would encourage anybody to read the Gospel of Mark. It's short, it's pretty simple, and then just ask yourself, does the Gospel of Mark sound like someone piecing together a bunch of random stories from the oral tradition, or does it sound like somebody making stuff up?
I would say so, but that's fine. Okay, so we'll go ahead and end it here.
Yeah, I think the big story is this is a minor historical point. It's not something that atheists need to get worked up over. We don't need to call each other fake atheists and whatever over stuff like this. Even if I support historical Jesus, that historical Jesus is like a thorn in the side of Christianity, because historical Jesus is the opposite of what any Christian wants to believe was true.
And I would say that there was at least one guy that actually said some of these things that were then recorded, or maybe some of these things happened to that were then recorded. But I don't think it was just one guy. And so we can't say that there is a admission that Jesus wouldn't recognize himself in the stories that are told about him today.
I mean, hard for me to prove that it was just one guy, but as long as we sort of agree that it's based on one or more people actually existing, that seems pretty good.
The multiplicity is where it's no longer a historical Jesus.
I think if we agree that there was one or more historical Jesuses, that sounds good.
I don't even think I would agree with that, because, as I said, we have one guy who gave, as you said, somebody may have given a sermon on a mount. Somebody said, "Oh, that's not," copied it down and then attributed it to this other character.
All right. So there's one or more characters who did or said the things that historians attribute to Jesus.
And then we have a number of stories about Jesus that we know actually didn't happen, like you said. I mean,
exactly.
That all of these other things are added that never really occurred.
And that's why Christians don't like historical Jesus, exactly for that reason.
And the description you yourself gave, that is my argument for why it is not a historical Jesus. So where can people find you? Put out a pitch before we close it up.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so I'm Jonathan Tweet. I'm on Twitter. I'm Jonathan M, as in Michael Tweet, and I'm on Google Plus, Jonathan Tweet, and you can also find me at grandmotherfish.com. Grandmotherfish is the first book to teach evolution to preschoolers, and that's my sort of big claim to fame. And that's how I got involved in the atheist community in the first place. Is atheists really love that book. And so grandmotherfish.com, or grandmotherfish at Twitter, grandmotherfish on Facebook and Google.
And you know what, you can trust what he says about theology because he has a gray beard.
I would like to think that gray beard is worth something.
In theological discussions, I'm sure it is.
Yeah.
All right, Mr. Tweet, thank you for being on.
Thanks, Aaron. Nice talking to you again.
Good night.
Take care.